Salam alaikum. Thank you very much, Ashraf, for this opportunity and invitation. Thank you to all of you. Ramadan Mubarak Karim to all of you. Here we are in the morning, beginning the day in California. So I wanted to thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the interest in this kind of discussions. I think that the issue of Islamophobia is a very important issue that I think is important to clarify what is Islamophobia. Because depending on how you define Islamophobia depends on the strategies you're going to go about facing this form of discrimination. So one of the main problems that I see today among brothers and sisters in the Ummah is the kind of a liberal understanding of Islamophobia. That is, Islamophobia is seen or perceived in the same way as, you know, other things, is seen as some kind of prejudice or misunderstanding about Islam, people who are ignorant. And the moment you define things this way, there are political consequences, because if you think Islamophobia is a misunderstanding about Islam, or you think Islamophobia is, you know, ignorant people or lack of education or things like this, it will immediately lead you to the wrong strategies. And so in a sense, the people who define Islamophobia this way think that if the solution to this is then to educate people and show them what is Islam and show them that we're not terrorists, show them that we are good Muslims, that they're bad Muslims, but that we're good Muslims, etc., etc. You know, so those strategies are, in a sense, designed for failure, because you are defining the problem in the wrong place. If you define the problem in the wrong place, or you're defining the causation of the problem in the wrong place, you're going to come up with the wrong solutions. What the thesis I want to discuss here and share with you is that something I've been saying for a long time is that Islamophobia is a form of racism. And that racism, to tackle racism, you need to understand what is racism. So let me first go over the discussion of what is racism. There is a logical sequence of the discussion here, because if I say Islamophobia is racism, I first have to define what is racism. Okay, I will first have to define what is racism. Because otherwise I'll be discussing, I'll be assuming a definition of racism that do not, that is not, how can I say, it's not correct. We need to first clarify what is racism, then demonstrate why once we define what is racism, then demonstrate why Islamophobia is a form of racism. And then after, the third point will be, how do we tackle racism or Islamophobia, you know? So my point is the following. Let's begin by discussing what is racism. In liberal societies, racism is always trivialized under the assumption that this is about ignorant people, people with lack of education, people that, you know, that require some kind of education, people who have crazy ideas about other people, You know, so basically, racism is reduced to a problem of stereotype and prejudice. Racism is defined based on stereotype and prejudice. I want to say that that kind of definition is very problematic, not because there's no prejudice or no stereotype. Of course they are. The problem is that in order to have racism, you need to have something else that is not just prejudice and stereotype. You need to have institutions, social structures of power enforcing certain policies that affect negatively a whole population that are the target of these state institutional policies. And you need to have, and at the same time, you have people who benefit from those policies affecting the population. So you have people with privilege and people with disadvantage when you have a structure of racism. So I want to give you a few examples so you understand that if there's something common to many of the people who theorize racism, especially people of color, people of global South people, etc., is that racism is always institutional. It's always structural. Racism is not just about people with wrong ideas, stereotype, and prejudice. Usually in Western liberal society, they love to define racism this way because that way what they achieve with that is to basically say that racism, if you are in the USA, racism will be then singled out to a small portion of the population. They will say, oh, it's this group of people, the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist groups who are racist because they are the ones with prejudice and stereotype. The rest of the society is okay. The same thing you will see in Europe today. They will say, oh, it's the neo-Nazis, these extreme right groups with prejudice, stereotypes, etc. But the rest of the society is okay because they're defining racism based on prejudice and stereotype. The moment you take that line of thought, then the problem becomes a problem of people that are ignorant, a small minority of people who happen to be ignorant, who happen to have prejudice, and all you need to do then to overcome it is educate them. Give them education so that they step out of their ignorance. That's the kind of liberal solutions that you find in many liberal societies across the world. I will say that strategy is going to lead you to failure because the problem of racism is not just stereotype or prejudice. The problem of racism is always institutional. It's always institutional. And that requires a different strategy. Let me give you a few examples so you understand what I'm trying to say in terms of the difference between prejudice, stereotype, and structural institutional racism. If I tell you the institutional behavior, for example, of the police institution, for example, or of the army, for example. Okay, let's take the police. The police have institutional practices, okay, that have a long durée. They have long time enforcing those practices. So you could go and see, let's say, you could go and when you see the police, when they intervene in certain communities, they arrive there, they knock the door, they show their badges, their IDs, and then what they try to, then they intervene. You see, there are other communities where they go, and they go with their weapons out. They go shooting, or they go beating up the people. And if they don't knock doors, they just destroy the door, destroy the house. So these are institutional practices that are embedded in institutions, in a long time processes, okay, of domination. And so what happened is that if you go and make the prejudice test or the stereotype test, okay, you might have a bunch of these police with prejudice, stereotypes, etc. You might have others that they pass the test, okay, that they might pass the test. So you go and do education for 6 months to these police that have prejudice stereotype, and you educate them 6 months, 1 year training. Then they pass the test, right? They pass the test of prejudice stereotypes, and then they go back to the police, and then they go to the same community and they do the same thing, because it's not about the police, the individual police, if they have prejudice or not. It's about the police as an institution. All these policemen receive orders. They have institutional practices, the way they behave with certain populations. So even if the individual police might pass the test of prejudice stereotype, they will still do the same thing. They will go and arrive in certain communities with their weapons out, destroying the door, not knocking the door, and beating up people, okay? Or even killing people. As opposed to other communities where they will go there and be very careful and show their badges and knock the door if they have to intervene. They will never dare to get to those communities and beat up everybody or shoot people or things like this. So this differential institutional behavior is, let me put it this way, is autonomous from the individual policeman mentality. You could have police with prejudice and police without prejudice. In the best case scenario, you can even have all the police without prejudice. They will still go and do the same thing because they receive orders. And also there are institutional practices. There is a culture of the institution of how they intervene with certain communities, okay? So that's always structural and institutional. And I wanna make that separation so that we understand that, of course, if the individual police have prejudice and stereotype, it might be, it might be worse in a sense, but it doesn't make any difference in terms of the behavior of the police, because the police is going to still go to those communities and in a violent way, practicing violence. So I will give you another example. In my work, I speak a lot about epistemic racism. And I talk about westernized universities. I said Western, I didn't say Western. Westernized university could be anywhere. University of New Delhi, any university in India, the majority of them are westernized universities. I call westernized universities those universities whose epistemic foundation is based on white men of 5 countries. Usually you're going to read a Frenchman, a German, a British, an American, secondarily an Italian. That's the canon of thought of all the disciplines in westernized university. You hardly see epistemic diversity in westernized universities. And the westernized university is a global structure of power and domination that is everywhere today. It is not just in Paris or New York or Frankfurt or London. It's everywhere in the world. It's a global structure of dissemination of Eurocentric thinking to create the third world neocolonial elites to run the affairs, the business of transnational corporations, of the metropolitan Western centers of the world, etc. So this university, westernized university, is very important to the formation, or let's say the deformation of the third world elites today, because it's based on an epistemology that I call racist sexist epistemology. Why is racist sexist? Because if you think that Western modified countries are the superior beings that have the superior epistemology, and then you inferiorize the rest of humanity, that's a structure of racism at the level of epistemology. Now, if you go to a westernized university that practices epistemic racism, most of the professors, you do the prejudice stereotype test, the majority of the professors, I would say 95% of the professors, might pass the test of prejudice and stereotypes. But when they go to the classroom, they practice epistemic racism. When they go to the classroom, they're teaching white man of the 5 countries, okay? And they're doing that because that's a requirement in westernized university, in sociology, in political science, in economics, in whatever department you go, philosophy, history of art, wherever you go in westernized universities. And you could see that in India, you could see that in Africa, anywhere you go, westernized universities there to produce precisely and disseminate Eurocentric thinking. And it's a machine of epistemicide, of destruction of alternative epistemologies, okay? Destruction of other cosmologies. So in the Western university, you have a practice as an institution, they practice epistemic racism. So, but the faculty, you might give them a test of prejudice stereotype and they might pass the test. Most of them, the majority of them, 85, 90, 95% of them. Still, when they go to the classroom, they're teaching the white man of the 5 countries. They're still practicing epistemic racism in the classroom because that's first a requirement of the discipline they are, okay? You have to teach those authors. And second, because many of them really believe that that's sociology, that's political science, that's economics, that's history, that's philosophy. So they really believe that there's nothing wrong in teaching only white minofied countries, as if the rest of the world haven't thought about those questions, okay? So they don't bring epistemic diversity to the classroom. They're only teaching Western males of 5 countries, okay? So I call that institutional racism. In this case, it's epistemic racism practiced by westernized universities. Now, I'm giving you that example to also show you another example of how individuals might not have racial prejudice or racial stereotype about other groups of people, but they might still practice racism in the institution because that's a requirement if they're working there, okay? If you go to a sociology department, okay, and you're going to teach, you know, all the critical thought of Islam, all the critical thought of indigenous people in the Americas, all the critical intellectuals from all these different traditions, you probably lose your job. Probably they won't even hire you, you know, because they don't want that in the classroom. What they want you to teach is the white man of the 5 countries. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, of course. There's always individuals trying to do the best they can within those structures to bring epistemic diversity to the classroom. But why I'm giving you this example, you know, next to the other one of the police, just to give you an example of another institution, the Westernized University, and how they have institutional practices that are racist, and that those practices, racist practices, are put forward by the institution independently of the faculty, what the faculty has in their mind, if they're prejudicial or not towards the people they are invisibilizing in the classroom, okay? So just to say, to summarize, the first point I want to summarize, that racism is always about institutional racism, structural racism, and the question of prejudice stereotype becomes a secondary issue. I'll give you another example. I, as a person, might have prejudice and stereotypes to X group of people, okay? And I can go to sleep and have nightmares, okay, about those people I have prejudice about, right? But next day, when I wake up, those people are not going to be massively excluded from their employments. Those people are not going to be massively killed or massively persecuted or, you know, beat up in the streets. Those people are not going to be excluded or discriminated in their citizenship rights. You know, we go over the list. Why? Because there's no institutional structures enforcing the prejudices I might have about that group of people. So the point I'm trying to say is that prejudice, stereotype are not enough to understand racism. You need to have structures of power domination, you know, institutions enforcing this and affecting negatively a population to have a situation of racism. And the same way it goes, you have two sides of the same coin. It's affecting negatively a bunch of people, but it's affecting positively another group of people. So racism always have people who have privilege out of racism and people who have disadvantages because of racism. So these are two sides of the same coin. So the second point I wanted to discuss with you is the point about the question about how racism in colonial history has had many markers. In the world we live today, because of the transatlantic slavery and how important that was in the formation of the modern world and capitalism, you know, how a lot of the wealth the West, you know, accumulated to develop their wealth and to the rise of the West, no, was founded on colonialism all over the world and slavery. And because transatlantic slavery was so important, color racism, skin color racism became very important as a marker of race. But in colonial history, this is not the only marker. There's been in colonial history many other markers about race and racism. And here is where many times we get confused. I'm going to give you a faraway example so that maybe it helps for you to think and rethink what is happening in India today. There are religious markers, there are ethnic markers, there are national identity markers. So there are many markers used in colonial history. It's not just a skin color, okay? And I'm saying that because many times we lose sight of this question. We reduce race and racism to question of color, skin color, and we forget that in colonial history, there was always many markers. And today, in the world we live, we still have those markers deployed as a marker of race and racism, okay? Even though religious identity, even though, national ethnic identity, language, etc., these are markers that are supposed to be cultural or religious or whatever, and seems to be unrelated to race and racism. I want to argue that they are markers of race and racism too. And I'm going to also give you some historical examples, because this goes back to even the formation of racism in the 15th, 16th century, 500 years ago. Because the first marker of racism was not color. Color came later. The first marker of racism was religious identity. And I want to argue that those of you who have seen my lectures on the conquest of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus, you know what I'm trying to say here, but let me continue with this, with first defining what is racism. So there are many markers of racism in colonial history and in the contemporary world. So if there are many markers, okay, part of what happened to us is that we tend to collapse the definition of racism with color racism. And in doing that, we fall into traps, because in the world we live today, and even in the past, racism was not all, color racism was not the sole marker of race and racism. There were always these other ones that the colonizers used to inferiorize populations, to put them below, dehumanize them. And so the religious marker was always there. The identity, ethnic identity, national identity, language, customs, the way you dress, there were many markers that were used to target, dehumanize population, targeting them as below the line of the human. So I want to clarify these 2 points. That first, racism is not just about stereotype or prejudice. It's about fundamentally structures of domination, institutions of domination. Second, that race has multiple markers. I'll give you an example. If you look at Ireland, the Irish, the Irish were 700 years colony of Britain, over 700 years. Now, the British in Ireland could not use skin color to mark the colonial racial hierarchy there. Why? Because the Irish were whiter in skin color than the British. So the marker of color, as skin color, did not work in that context. So what did they use? So they used a religious marker. They used Catholics and Protestants. So if you look at this conflict in a superficial way, you might think this is a religious war or a religious discrimination. But when you look carefully and in a more profound way, the relationship of Britain with Ireland, the Irish people were submitted to processes of dehumanization, violence, even famine, okay? Even processes of genocide by the British. And the way the British saw the Irish were always as inferior beings. If you look at the books about sociobiology, these racist books that went on until the 60s in Britain, for example, there was always a chapter about, African people, about indigenous people, about the Irish. The Irish always have a chapter there. And they will measure their brain, and all of that to prove that these people were non-human, subhuman, inferior to the white man or to the white race, right? So I'm saying this because to bring you let's say, an example of how, in the case of the relationship between Ireland and the British, it was a racial colonial domination. And they were inferiorizing below the line of the human, the Irish, and the implementation of violent methods against the Irish people was brutal over centuries, And so I give you that example to show you how even in the context of a place that we call, Ireland, we see them from the global south, we see them as white people, we see them as a country in Europe, right? But when you examine carefully the history of Ireland vis-a-vis the British, there was racism in that relationship. And the marker was not skin color, the marker was religious identity, okay? So this is, I'm giving you that example to show you how there are multiple markers in colonial history. Even today, if you go, for example, to many places in Africa after so-called independence, because we know that in Africa today, what you have is what Kwame Nkrumah coined as neo-colonialism, new forms of colonialism emerging after formal independence. That is, these countries, as many other countries in the third world, even though colonial administrations were defeated, that didn't entail that they were now beyond colonial relations. They were still subordinated to the Western imperialist powers. But now that subordination acquired new forms. So it's a continuation of colonialism through new forms. So for example, you could have, economically, these countries kept being subordinated to the global north. And politically, these countries they will put there the westernized elites of the third world to run the show and to put them in power as intermediaries of the global north and the working classes that they are still super exploiting. So in many countries of Africa, the westernized elites happen to have a black face, okay? A black face. Now, who are these Western elites? Usually they are groups that under colonialism, that is ethnic groups, elites from ethnic groups that under the colonial time, they were privileged by the West in the colonial administration. Once the West, leave the country, formally leave the country, and now you have a formally independent country, you have these westernized elites that have been trained and have been privileged by the colonizers now in running the new so-called independent state. And now they're the ones who are going to run the show. And now they're going to put below them a lot of ethnic, religious groups, etc., different groups inside the territory that are going to be subordinated in a colonial racist way to these new elites, okay, that happen to be from one ethnic group or one religious group, who happen to be privileged. It's called divide and rule. The British, the French, all these colonizers, before leaving, they will make sure that those countries will be split, so that whatever happens, they will have the upper hand in being able to control the country. And they will always negotiate to live in power those elites, westernized elites, that they always privileged in colonial history, so that they have better control over the country once the country becomes formally independent, okay? This is what Kwame Nkrumah, the Pan-Africanist leader, named or conceptualized as neo-colonialism, new forms of the continuation of colonialism in the world, okay? So independence did not entail liberation. Independence entailed the continuation of colonial structures of domination under new methods, new means, okay? So, so you have today in Africa, the color question, the market of color doesn't work for many of these westernized elites in power, because they have the same skin color as the people they are oppressing and the people they are inferiorizing below the line of the human, the people they are dehumanizing in racist ways. So now you have black westernized elites running states in Africa, okay? But they cannot use color as a marker because they cannot establish any marker with the people they are oppressing. So what do they use? They use religious identity. They use tribal identity. They use ethnic identity, national identity. They use multiple identities as markers of dehumanizing a group of people and hyperhumanizing another group of people, okay? Of inferiorizing groups of people and making superior the ethnic groups of which these westernized elites belong to, okay? So if you look at India, you see very clearly how, in a sense, you have an elite that is Hindi, the Hindi elite that were Hindu elite that were privileged, in the transition from colonial administration to the formal independent state in India. And these Hindu elites basically took over and run the show and subordinated under their rule the rest of the group's identities, religious marked under different markers, Muslim, religious identity, the Sikhs, Tamils, etc. So you go over different, so with one group they use ethnicity, with other groups they use religious identity, with other groups they will use, I don't know, I mean, there are many markers that are used today in India, to mark this difference between the superior racial group and the inferior groups. And you could see that very clearly in India today. So they cannot use color, because in terms of color, you cannot make that much distinction, in between the Hindi elites, and the Hindu elites and the population they're oppressing. Okay, there are brown elites, running India today. That I call westernized elites, and when I say westernized elites, I'm talking more about the role they play, because you could have a culture different from the West, but still be playing the modern Western project, okay, of the so-called nation state, okay, subordinated to transnational corporations of the West. You see, this is why I call them westernized elites. And epistemically, even though they might have a different identity from the West, epistemically, they are Western-centric, Eurocentric in the way they see the world, okay? So this is why I call them westernized elites, okay? Mostly because of their epistemology, their worldview, even though they might have a different spirituality, even though they might have a different identity from the West, even though that if they go and visit the West, they might be seen as another inferior race in Paris or London, but in the place where they're living, in the place where they are the dominant elites, they play the role of these intermediary neo-colonial elites between the West and the rest, okay? So that's why I call them westernized elites. So when I say the West, I'm not talking about a geography. I'm talking about a positionality in power relations. So when I say the westernized elites, I'm not talking about geography. You could be from India. You could be from a country in Africa. You could be a westernized elite, even though you have never visited any of the geographic West, okay? You might be out of the geographic West. You might even never visit any of the countries of the geographic West. I'm not talking about the geographic West. I'm talking about after 500 years of European colonial expansion through colonial administrations all over the world, there is a West that is the marker of superiority everywhere we are in the world today. And that's why I talk about not Western elites, but westernized elites or westernized neo-colonial elites in the third world today that are the intermediaries between the West and the rest. That is between the West, European or American or other powers, and the population they are super exploiting. And so what I'm trying to say here is that then if race have different markers, okay, what is racism? Is it that there are many racisms in plural? I don't think so. I think there is only one racism. And this is what I'm going to now try to discuss with you. There's only one form of racism, one definition for racism. There's not 100. I'm talking about markers. The markers of race could be multiple, but race is one thing. And this is what I'm going to now discuss with you. Race for me is a structure of domination, of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. So it's a structure of domination where the people who are classified above the line are considered hyperhuman, superior beings. And the people who are classified below the line are considered non-human, subhuman. That is, they're being dehumanized. So this classification allows for them, it can be marked, superiority, inferiority, could be marked in different ways, with skin color. It could be marked with religious identity, could be marked with ethnic national identity. There are many markers for this. The important is if the marker is referring to a structure of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. This is what is important to have in mind and to keep there, because you could have religious identity, religious conflicts. You could have religious conflict where you don't have necessarily this structure of superiority, inferiority in place, okay? And that's a religious discrimination. But when you have a conflict where you have a marker of where religious identity is working as a marker of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, and then you submit the people who happen to be considered dehumanized, you know, non-human, subhuman, to processes of violence and dispossession, there you have a structure of racism. Because what defines racism is not the marker. This is where we get confused many times in discussion about racism. We collapse the marker with the definition. So in many places, we take color racism as the definition or as the marker for race. So if there's no color racism, then we assume there is no racism in that place, right? And in European Union today, there are all these debates because in European Union, there are people who are saying, you know, Islamophobia is a form of racism. But here comes European Union elites, you know, and say, no, that's not racism because Muslims are of all colors in Europe. You see, they're using color racism to dismiss Islamophobia racism because they're collapsing racism with skin color. But the point and the argument today is not that racism, the only marker for race is skin color. Is that Islamophobia is serving as a marker to dehumanize people, no matter your color of skin in Europe today, that are being, you know, classified as savages, barbarians, etc., and submitted to forms of violence and dispossession. So these forms of violence and dispossession are being, the Muslim population in Europe have been submitted to this, most of the Muslim population there, and that's a marker for race when you have a structure of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. You know, whatever marker you use, you could use many markers to mark that structure. Now, I talk about zone of being, non-being using Fanon, Frantz Fanon. People in the superior who are considered hyperhumanized as superior beings, they're considered to be in the zone of being. People who happen to be considered or classified as inferior beings, as human or as subhumans or non-humans, they're in the zone of non-being. I want to explain a little this. Zone of being, non-being refers to different forms of through which racism is manifested. For example, zone of being here means the human activities, human social activities, the forms of existence. So the form of dressing, the form of thinking, the forms of praying, the forms of, you know, forms of dressing is your culture, right? Forms of thinking, your epistemology. Form of praying, your spirituality. Forms of pedagogy. Forms of thinking of political authorities. Forms of thinking about the economy. Forms of all these institutional practices, no, that defines a group of people, okay, is split between in the zone of being, all the forms of praying, thinking, all the forms of living, all the forms of relating between human beings and other forms of nature, for example, they are considered the normal, human, superior, civilized ways of doing things, okay, in the zone of being. In the zone of non-being, because people are dehumanized, their ways of praying, their ways of thinking, their ways of relating with other forms of life, their ways of living, their ways of practicing politics or economics or whatever, they're all considered savage, uncivilized, barbarian, inferior ways of doing things. So, and zone here is a positionality, it's not a geography, it's a positionality in power relations. So zone of being, we're talking here about the social space, not the geographical space. So you have zone of being, zone of non-being. The point Fanon is making here is the following. Racism, this structure of domination, of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, is expressed in the dispossession of resources. That means economically, you're being excluded, you're being discriminated, you're being dispossessed of your resources, of your labor, of your community's resources, etc. Okay, that in itself is really bad, okay, for the communities who happen to be classified in the zone of non-being. You become a cheap labor force, or you become a slave, or you become a subordinated inferior class, okay? That in itself is already problematic, no? Or in the case of India, the untouchables, no? The Dalits, etc. Okay, the cheap labor force. So, and then you have, in the zone, the discrimination in your citizenship rights, okay? For the people who happen to be classified as non-human or subhuman. So that in itself, the economic discrimination, citizenship discrimination is already terrible. It's really very bad for your opportunities in life, okay? But on top of that, your forms of praying, your forms of living, your forms of being in the world, it's all in question mark. They're all going to be markers of your barbarianism, your inferiority, And so when he talks about zone of being non-being, he's saying, listen, it's already bad you've been discriminated, racially discriminated, and in terms of the economics and your citizenship rights and your rights. But on top of that, it's even worse. All you do is going to be put in question mark, everything you do. Because it's not just economics or your citizenship right. It's also your forms of praying, your language, your forms of being, your forms of thinking, your epistemology. The aesthetics, the forms of good taste and beautiness, okay? The aesthetics is not going to be seen as inferior aesthetics. Your forms of beautiness, the forms of good taste that community has is going to be seen as savage and barbarian. And in the zone of being, the aesthetics is going to be considered the superior ways of beautiness and of what is considered beauty and what is considered good taste. So what Fanon is targeting here is how the problem of racism is it just goes over all the spheres of social existence. It's not just economic or your rights, okay? It goes over everything you do, everything your community do is going to put a question mark there about the barbarian, uncivilized, inferior ways of doing things, okay? So that's why this thing about zone of being, non-being is very important, because it goes into different spheres of social existence that are also going to be put in question, okay, to the people who happen to be dehumanized. And the things, the zone of being, everything they do is going to be, the way they do things is going to be considered the civilized superior ways and the human ways of doing things. Okay, that's the normal. It's going to be considered the normal superior human ways of doing things. If you do things different from them, in the way you pray, or in the way you think, or in the way you behave, or in your concept of aesthetics, the beautiness, etc., you're going to be seen as a barbarian, inferior being, okay? As a savage way of doing things, as a barbarian way of doing things. Now, what in the zone of being, the people are considered superior, is not a homogeneous zone. There are conflicts inside that zone. Sometimes those conflicts could be very, very hard, okay? So there are class divisions inside the zone of being. There are gender domination inside the zone of being, okay? There are even sometimes, there are even national domination in the zone of being. But in the zone of being, the reason I call them zone of being, despite their conflicts and divisions, is that everybody who happened to be in the zone of being, that is everybody who is classified as part of the superior race, as part of the superior beings, or the superior religion, right? If the marker is religious, these people are going to live racial privilege. They're going to all live racial privilege. Even the people who happen to be workers exploited in that zone, or women who happen to be, how can I say, dominated, excluded for patriarchal reasons in the zone of being, they still live their oppressions with racial privilege. That is, they're going to live their oppression with better resources, better working conditions in the case of class exploitation than the workers in the zone of non-being. Okay? In the zone of non-being, you live all these oppressions, but you live them aggravated by racial domination. So the reason I call the people in the zone of non-being, I use the term zone of non-being despite the multiplicity, heterogeneity that you will find in the zone of being or non-being. The reason I use these terms is that the people happen to be classified above the line of the human in the zone of being, okay? They are considered, they live racial privilege. The people in the zone of non-being, they live racial oppression. So what happened is that racial domination, racial oppression, even the people oppressed in the zone of being, they live their oppressions with privilege because of the racial privilege. That is, they live their oppressions with certain conditions that give them some advantage over their exploited workers in the zone of non-being. So in the zone of non-being, what is happening is that because these people are dehumanized, they live racial oppression. So racial oppression aggravates class oppression, gender oppression, national oppression, they aggravate it. In the case of zone of being, the oppressed people, they are live the oppressions mitigated by racial domination, racial privilege, mitigated. Look at these two words. I said, in the zone of being, even the oppressed live their oppressions mitigated by racial domination, by the racial privilege, because racial privilege gives them some advantage, even if they are working classes. And in the zone of being, people live the same oppressions, but aggravated by racial domination. Now, this mitigated, aggravated has to do with the following. This is very important, please pay attention. It has to do with the materiality of domination that is deployed in each zone. The materiality of domination. In the zone of being, because the dominant elites, okay, consider the people they oppress in the zone of being part of the human race, part of the normal ways of doing things, they acknowledge to them certain rights and certain privilege, and so they use methods of regulation and emancipation to manage the conflicts there. Regulation means cause of law. I will recognize labor rights there. I will recognize I am the dominant sector there, dominant white, the dominant elite there. It could be in the West, in Europe, it could be the white elites, right? Capitalist white, elites. Or in the case of India, the Hindi, westernized, neocolonial elites, okay? And so they're going to, in a sense, use methods of regulation and emancipation. That means they're going to extend to the oppressed people in the zone of being, to the people they consider part of the human race and superior race, even though they are in a disadvantage for class reason, gender reason, or national reason, whatever. They're going to acknowledge to them codes of law, democratic rights, citizenship rights, human rights, labor rights, women rights, you name it. So the laws of the Constitution more or less applies to them. And emancipatory discourses, that is, the people oppressed can make claims of equality, make claims of autonomy, freedom, liberty, etc., that is going to be really recognized. So there is a negotiation to manage the conflicts there. So they leave the conflicts with peaceful means, with exceptional moments of violence. It's not that there's zero violence. There are moments of violence in the zone of being, but there are always exceptions to the rule. Usually, they manage the conflicts through peaceful means, through codes of law, court negotiation, acknowledgement of rights, and formal acknowledgement of rights, extension of emancipatory discourses like freedom, liberty, autonomy, equality, and you name it, that the subaltern people in that zone can make claim to, and it's recognized by the dominant sector, at least formally. But then in the zone of non-being, the methods used by these same dominant elites is going to be quite different, because this population have been dehumanized. The methods they use is violence and dispossession. Violence and dispossession, not as an exception to the rule, but as a constant, with exceptional moments of peace. So dispossession is, they're going to be dispossessing you continuously of your resources. Violence, they're going to, every time there is a conflict, they're going to use violence. Codes of law, such as citizenship rights, human rights, etc., collapses in the zone of non-being, because the dominant westernized elites do not recognize the humanity in the people below the line of the human. So all these codes of law are going to collapse. They're not going to be recognized fully to the populations considered non-human or subhuman. So look at the difference here. There is a differential materiality of domination. So for me, listen, I've been talking about racism. I haven't defined racism yet. Now I'm in the position to be able to define it. In a sense, when we talk about racism, we're talking about a structured domination of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, where the people who happen to be superior are considered hyperhumanized, and people below the line of the human are considered non-human, subhuman, that is dehumanized. And this difference, this form of classification then implies a differential materiality of domination. In one case, the hyperhuman, they use regulation, emancipatory discourses. And so they produce life, even if those are mediocre lives, okay? So there is a process of material production of life in the zone of being, even if that life is mediocre. In the zone of non-being, they're going to deploy methods of violence and dispossession, producing premature death. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about life or death. We're not talking about, something superficial. There's a group of, racism is a group of people that have prejudice and they have stereotypes about other people. We need to educate them. They have the wrong idea. We need to show them that we're good Muslims. No, it's not about that. Racism is a process of violence and dispossession. This systematically applied to the people who happen to be dehumanized as a way to produce premature death. So you have there, when I say premature death can arrive to you from receiving a bullet in your head, okay, from arbitrary violence of the institutional structure of the state against your community, against your people, from being killed directly by a bullet, okay, to having premature death because you don't get the resources to get a good hospital care, or you don't get enough food to get a good healthy body, okay, or you don't get enough resources to get for your community to be protected from, let's say, environmental pollution, so you have also environmental racism there. So, and so on. So you have processes of premature death that can arise to you in the zone of non-being, okay, as part of a process of dehumanization in which the methods of domination are going to be different. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about a differential materiality of domination in which one group, the ones who happen to be considered superior beings, the regulation and emancipation produce, in a sense, life in that zone with exceptional moments of death or exceptional moments of conflict that led to death. In the case of the zone of non-being, you have as a constant materiality of domination that pass through dispossession and violence with exceptional moments of peace. And what that produces is premature death. So when we talk about racism, the question, now let's go back to the liberal definition, where they define racism as people with the wrong ideas, prejudice, stereotype, etc. They need education. We need to educate them. We need to show them how good Muslim we are, etc. You can be forever doing that. You're going nowhere, because when we talk about racism, we're talking about institutional structures that are producing life to one population and premature death to the other. So it's more profound because we're talking about institutions and methods of domination that are different. So we have a differential materiality of domination, okay, that we need to pay attention when we talk about racism. And so the point I'm trying to make, to summarize, that Islamophobia is a marker of race, especially if you look at the history of Islamophobia in the modern world. Since the beginning, the early period, in the conquest of Al-Andalus, they were already using as a marker of identity, of inferiority, religious identity. So in the early period of the modern European colonial expansion, they were not using color. They were using religious identity and Islamophobia from the beginning. And then you have, with indigenous people in the Americas, when they colonized the Americas, they used the concept of people without a soul. So they were using theological concepts, you see, religious identity, to classify population in the early modern period. So they were against the Muslims in the conquest of Al-Andalus, it was religious identity. Against the indigenous people in the Americas, they were using people with a soul and people without a soul. So they called the indigenous people, people without a soul. They called Black people, people without a soul. In the early period, the whole thing was theological markers, okay? And it got, in a sense, entangled, because then later in the process of, in the 16th century, once you have the fall of Al-Andalus in the late 15th century, then the population, the Moors, which is called the Moriscos, no, the Moors, the people who were forced to conversion in Andalusia, in the south part of the Iberian Peninsula, when they were colonized by the Castilian Catholic monarchy, then the concept of people without soul that they developed against indigenous people in the Americas was brought back to the Iberian Peninsula, and they start calling the Moors that were now formally Christians, okay, that were born Christian, baptized as Christian, as people without a soul. And so they start enslaving them, and they start doing all these atrocities. Immediately, this classification that was built in the Americas of people with soul, that is the European, and people without soul, the indigenous people, was brought back to the Iberian Peninsula, and now reclassifying the Moriscos, the Moors, as inferior races, okay? That's when Islamophobia, that was a form of religious discrimination in European Middle Ages, turned racial, because now it's not a problem that you have the wrong God or the inferior God or the inferior religion. It's that the people who pray to the inferior religion, to the inferior God, and practice the inferior religion, they are themselves inferior. So now it's a different question. Now it's not a question about your theology, because in fact, these people were all now Christians, formally. Now it's a question about your humanity. If you don't have a soul, it doesn't matter, you know, who you are, you're Christian, Muslim, whatever. If you're a descendant of the Muslim and you're Christian today, you are coming from a group of people who have no soul, so you don't have a soul. So that was the first marker. Later, with the transatlantic slavery in the Americas, you know, kidnapping African people and transporting them by force to be enslaved in the Americas, then you have colored racism coming in. And that came in the 17th century. The color racism was something of the 17th century. But in the 16th century, in the first period of the European colonial expansion, the markers were not color. And they were already enslaving Africans since the 15th century. But the color question was not the central question. The central question was your religious identity, if you have a soul or not, and those kind of things, you know? So later came color racism, but it doesn't mean that Islamophobia as a racial marker disappeared. It continued there. Sometimes it got entangled because then you have African population, you know, Black Muslims, for example, that were then color and religious marker were tied together, okay? And you have other populations that were not necessarily Black and were also classified as subhuman and non-human in the zone of non-being because you happen to be Muslim or you happen to be, I don't know, indigenous from another, you know, from the Americas. You could be Aymara, you were Inca, Maya, Aztec, whatever your identity, you were already classified below the line of the human because you were supposed not to have a soul. So look at this. I'm saying this because we need to stop thinking that Islamophobia is a form of religious discrimination. That's it. No, Islamophobia is more profound than that. Islamophobia is a marker of racial colonial domination. And we need to start making these connections, okay? And second, we need to also overcome the idea that these kind of forms of domination, of Islamophobic form of domination, is a form of misunderstanding, some kind of prejudice, stereotype due to ignorance. And no, this has nothing to do with that. It has to do with structures of domination of the modern world. When you have this concept of nation state, okay, one nation, one state, one population, you have a problem there because that kind of structure, that the Europeans have taken all over the world, okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's a fiction. There's nowhere in the world where you have a one-to-one correspondence between the identity of the state and the identity of the population. No place in the world. That's a fiction. Everywhere in the world, you always have state identity and the population living under that state having multiple identities. But the moment you have this structure of nation state, is perfect institutional structure of the modern civilization to precisely privilege one group of people above the line of the human and then exclude a bunch of people under that territory below the line of the human. And usually the westernized elites in the third world today leading those so-called nation states today are practicing through this institution racial colonial domination over the populations that they are dominating in their territories. And the nation state comes perfect for those kind of structures of exclusion, domination, exploitation, because it's the fictional pretension that the state has to have one identity, and that identity should correspond to one population, and anybody who is not within that identity should be excluded, exterminated, eliminated, etc. So this is there you have the structures of genocide. There you have the structures of extermination, the logic of extermination in this kind of Western-centric forms of political authority that were globalized all over the world, in the third world, after colonialism, after the demise of colonial administrations. So we need to pay attention to this, because what, in my opinion, Islamophobia in India is not a problem of ignorance, lack of knowledge about Islam, or is not a problem about religious discrimination. We're talking about racial discrimination. And to fight that, you need to fight it politically. That is, the way to overcome that is to fight and destroy the structures that produce zone of being, non-being. That's a political struggle. That's not a struggle for, of educating the people who have prejudice and stereotype. These people, it's not about ignorance. It's about structures of power and domination. I will stop here to open for discussion.